welcome to the Bacon Show. I'm Mike.
I'm Stefan.
This is going to be a serious one. It's going to be a fun one, though, I think.
And if we don't confuse literally ourselves and everyone else.
When I confuse myself.
Oh,
not if. This is not going to be an if. we are going to talk about free will.
Are we
which
free
is very interesting, and I would say as non-scientists, as non-philosophers, as non-theologians, do we even know what we're talking about?
We have no reason to talk about this, is what he's basically saying.
Which is
So
why
it should be a
we're
good
talking
show.
about it. That's right. It's going to be a great show. It's going to be a good one.
I just want to know, are we free to even talk about this?
I don't know. I don't know.
That's the number one question.
And I feel like by the end of this, my answer will be the same.
I still don't know. So, I mean, the topic came up because how did we land on this?
We were talking about like science and religion a little bit, and somehow we got on the free will kind of topic a little bit towards the end, I think.
Yeah, it was so Sam Harris, if anyone knows who Sam Harris is, he released a podcast on his final thoughts on free will, on his interpretation of the concept of it. And then you sent back another thought on free will from maybe a religious perspective. And I think that's where we were like, yeah, this could make a good topic.
This could be interesting, yeah. We should define what we think free will is.
Yeah, I think even the definition is where I started to stumble.
I went straight to Merriam-Webster. I went to the dictionary.
Exactly.
This is what I'm sticking with.
So I found a version of this definition as well. The ability to choose between more than one viable option or action, and in which that choice was up to the user. So I guess that's as an idea, it's the opportunity to pick between options where you feel like you're the one doing the picking.
Right. Yeah, that's pretty good. I liked this one too from the dictionary. Freedom of humans to make choices that are not determined by prior causes or divine intervention.
Ooh, so that is so important. So the determined by prior causes.
That's where we start to get into the weeds, right?
Well, this is where the proponents of free will as an illusion are falling back to what's called determinism, which says that all events are predicated on prior causes. So everything that has happened was based upon things that had happened previously, which includes the environment around you, who your parents are, your genes, genetics, all of those things that we didn't choose. All of that plays into this scenario of determinism.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that maybe that helps with that part of that definition a little bit.
I think so. The thing that I feel like I've been confused on in this initial idea of free will is that, like, let's say we're deciding what we want for dinner, and we have Chipotle or Pizza Hut. We're going out to eat, and it's terrible choice night.
so say Pizza Hut. It's been a long time.
The choice is obvious.
Yeah.
And let's say you pick one, whichever it is, and then the next night you decide that you have the same options. And then you pick the other one. Well, then, people could say, well, isn't that free will? I mean, you picked one, and then in the future, let's say if you were at the first choice, you look in the future, you just say, when I do this again, I'll pick the other one. And that's kind of like that idea of free will. But I think
Right.
for me, what I realized was when the discussion about free will is taking place, it's always predicated on what's happening now.
Hmm.
So if you like determinism, then whatever that future event is, you would still say, well, it was determined on all the prior causes up until that present time that you made the choice again,
Right.
that type of thing. So,
So it would be more like the free will question would not be what you're choosing next time. It would be like if you could go back in time,
correct.
could you make a different decision?
That is exactly it. And
Right. Yeah.
this is obviously an impossible thing because we cannot
Right.
rewind the universe.
Yet.
But the concept of determinism says if you rewound the universe, the end of my sentence that I'm speaking right now is always going to be the end of the sentence that I just spoke. Always
Right.
and always and forever and ever. That's determinism. I didn't have a choice before I said the end of the sentence to actually say something different.
That's yeah, man. I,
Let's throw an experiment
I
out
don't
there.
know. Yeah, do it.
Think of a balloon.
Okay.
Okay. What color is the balloon?
Got it. Do I need to tell you, or is it like a magic trick?
No
I
magic.
keep it to myself.
It's a really
Okay.
simple experiment.
The balloon is red.
Okay. It's a red balloon. So prior to your brain uh, showing you a red balloon, did you have an option to pick a different color?
I would like to think so,
But
but
if
I
you
don't know.
exactly. So if you really pay attention to that exercise, what you might find is that your brain showed you the red balloon
Mm,
and then that was it.
right.
Now, your brain could have showed you more than one balloon. And let's say you decided between red and yellow that you ultimately picked yellow. You're not in control of the thoughts of the balloon that your brain is presenting itself. And this is another tenet of free will that I think is extremely important is that the thoughts that arise in our brains, we are not the author of, meaning we
Right.
aren't the one in control. We are simply bearing witness to the thoughts as they become known to our consciousness. And this is
So
a very tough
okay.
concept to wrap your brain around.
Yeah, I was gonna say. So if we are not in control, what is in control?
Well, and so I think this is where determinism was born.
Hmm.
It's everything around us, every experience that we've experienced, all the variables that are so far in our past that seemingly are invisible are all influencing what our brains are processing. And we like to tell, we as in humans, it appears from what I gather from the philosophers that like this concept,
Hmm.
will tell ourselves stories to maintain this kind of an illusion that we are the one who picked this, or we're the one who thought that, or we wanted to make this decision contrary
Right.
to what we wanted previously, or however you tell yourself that. But since we're not the author of what bubbles up, then where's the freedom in that? So the thought experiment would go, if the balloon was red and the balloon was yellow, that's what your brain showed you, and you decided on one of those. Were you free to decide on any of the colors that your brain didn't show you? Now, this is a thought experiment
Right.
because you can't actually get there. But the concept is that no, you can't pick a color that you were never picking, that you were never presented, that
Right.
you
Right.
weren't you weren't thinking of. So where's the freedom in that?
That's
Because
it. Yeah. That's really. Yeah. I'm trying to work through this. This is a difficult one.
and Harris said, if this is probably one of the most free types of choices that we're going to ever have. Think
Right.
of a balloon. His example in his podcast was think of a movie.
Right.
Like, of all the constrained choices that we have in life, this is probably one of the most freer choices that we'll ever come across.
Yeah.
And if we can't find free will here, then we most certainly can't find free will in anything that we might call more important than the name of a movie or a balloon.
Right. Now, this is one of the things I was thinking about when I was listening to the podcast a little bit
Hmm.
and then kind of cross referencing some other stuff. It feels like to me that in some ways this is describing the beginning of a thought, like the impulse of a thought, but is it actually describing the thought?
Well, I
Does that
think
make sense?
it does make sense. And this is also another part that I've had a tough time understanding. And I'm
Hmm.
not sure if my understanding has grown from that really tough part, but I'm going to try to parrot back what I've heard about this. And this is where we get into determinism, sorry, versus fatalism.
Yeah.
Fatalism is that concept that no matter what you think or do or choose, the end is always going to be the same. So why do anything? Why get out of bed? Why fight a good fight, quote unquote? Why do anything?
Hmm.
So what you are saying is the initial thought appears, and then you've got a choice, right?
Yeah.
What determinism is saying is, if the initial thought was always influenced by everything that happened in your past and everything around you, then there is no freedom, true freedom of will in that scenario. It's all based on
Okay.
prior causal events, meaning that if you were able to rewind the universe in some miraculous, event, you
Hmm.
would always pick the same thing because all the influences, all the factors that that decision held that were around you would all be the same. And so the outcome would never, ever change.
Would never. Yeah.
Your brain would never be in a state that would give you a different color than the balloon that it gave you. And so
Okay.
I think that's the thing that's been challenging for me, because the question would be, well, why try to do anything? Because it sounds like everything is so
Right.
locked in place. And my question to that is it possible then, let's say we wanted to improve our lives in some fashion,
Hmm.
is it possible then to put ourselves in a future more a future better state to reach that goal? Meaning, can I make a choice today? A good example is
Right.
if I ran 2 miles a day every day. Well, if I
Hmm.
did that in 30 days, one would say I might be in better shape. And so if I just made that decision daily, I'm building the momentum, let's call it, to get to that end
Right.
goal. Is it possible to put yourself in a future better situation to where the influences around you are going to help you make that decision? It's almost like, if you hang out with good people, are you apt to make better decisions in the future or not?
Right. I was thinking the same thing, but I was going the negative route. As someone who has made what I call propaganda a little bit in the past, I was like, well, could you make propaganda to influence future choices? If we don't have free will, how do we make that work to manipulate the population into thinking what we want them to think?
Yes. Yes. I think the answer is still the same, because if you buy into the concept of determinism, then no matter how far you go back, everything arises out of a prior cause.
Right.
So if you tip a domino and you make them go all the way back to the beginning of life, all those causes are going to eventually lead you to whatever decision you're thinking you're making no matter what. So that's not to say that things don't influence us in certain ways. And this is I think the really
Hmm.
confusing thing, or it has been for me. You know what I mean? It's that idea that can we actually pivot in different ways? And Harris talked about this as well, and he's saying that you can, and it's not a paradox. And I'm like,
Okay.
really?
It seems like a paradox. I
It's
mean, it almost seems like it's an explanation to almost allow free will. Like to almost kind of influence future decisions.
well, it's yes, it's certainly saying that fatalism uh is not what's going on, which I would
Yeah.
say is a good
Yeah,
thing
I would
because
say throw fatalism out. That's crazy.
yeah, the idea of whatever, no matter what we do, the end is always going to be the same
Yeah,
very
I
defeating
don't like that.
concept. We definitely don't want that, but
Hmm.
I think it is important to think that you can influence, and your decisions certainly do matter.
Yeah.
um
It almost feels like a religious free will concept that I don't like, which was the idea of like you can choose what road to go down, but that road is already predetermined or known. It would,
yeah,
is how a religious person might say.
and I think this is actually a paradox that I've never heard a very good answer to from the
Hmm.
religious folks that believe in this idea that God knows the future, which is
Right.
to say that the future is determined. And at the same time, God wants to give you the
You have
freedom to choose to accept him or
exactly.
not. So it's almost like God is working against himself then
Yeah.
to do what exactly? Like,
This was one of my big things too. The way that I had it explained to me was like the road kind of idea, and the other one was the fishbowl idea. I don't know if you've heard that one
no.
before, which was someone, I mean, super smart person who I hate to admit it, but is probably a better filmmaker than I am in a lot of ways. I was discussing this with, and they said it's like a fishbowl. You can go wherever you want as long as you're in the fishbowl. And I was like, how is that free will? And they're like, how is it not free will? You can go wherever you want as long as you're in the fishbowl.
Well, does the fish doesn't have the freedom to choose to jump out of the bowl?
Yeah, this is what I tried to
And so that
explain.
that sounds more like determinism than, really
It does.
maybe anything else. But the
Yeah.
the thing that's contradictory is the idea that God lets you choose your path, but also at the same time knows what you're going to choose. And
Right.
I don't know what the end game is from there. It's the same question, when something tragic happens, people may ask, well, where was God in this situation?
Yeah. Or
Why
God was
didn't
in control or
Yeah. So
these
it's e-
ideas.
s-
Yeah.
so from a non-believer perspective, either God is impotent or evil, meaning
Right.
that God actually doesn't have the power that the Bible states he has and can't actually affect these future events. Most religious people won't subscribe to that at all. And the
Yeah.
idea of evilness means that God is perfectly willing to let innocent people have tragedies happen to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and just stand by and do nothing, but is perfectly
Right.
capable of doing that. Uh,
Yeah.
and
That's
it,
called the babysitter test.
yeah,
Your God has to be able to pass the babysitter test, in my view.
what's the
Right.
babysitter test?
If you believe in an all knowing, all loving God,
Mm-hmm.
and yet knowing what you know about that God, you wouldn't hire that God as your babysitter because you know that God could stop that bus that's about to hit that car but chooses not to. That's a God you wouldn't hire as a babysitter, and your God has to pass the babysitter test in order to be a loving God. So that's what
Correct.
that is.
Yeah. I mean, how can like millions of children under the age of 5 die every year?
Right. Yeah.
And
Yeah. The free will thing, I thought that was my problem, but my problem turned out to be the concept of an all powerful God, I think,
Mm.
more than like the free will issue. The free will thing, I still haven't figured out.
Well, I think that they kind of go hand in hand. And I think this is why, if free will is an illusion, then the God that is described this way is also an illusion, because
Mhm.
these things actually can't happen uh, outside of something that's completely magical, or which is to say supernatural. And
Right.
magic, I guess, would be the only way to describe it. But it doesn't follow, it doesn't actually make any sense. And
Yeah.
that helped me kind of pull that string and say, well, this, you know, how can I believe in something that has no logical sense to it, or it
Yeah.
defies
There's
so many rules?
some people, I think some philosophers would, and I'm going to talk about this, but I don't really understand it,
Okay.
but would say that in the paradox is where you find the divine, because you're talking about an infinite in a God, and you're talking about a finite in human beings. And so to bring those two together is going to be where your paradoxes occur. Like the story of Jesus on the cross, who says, "My God, why have you forsaken me? Forsaken me?" And so you have the concept of a God who is experiencing physically atheism, and there's the paradox that happens there. And they would say this is where you find, the divine potentially, where the finite and infinite come together, and you have paradox. I don't totally understand that, but there are some philosophers that would talk about that.
Well, so my opinion about that is that it's not meant to be understood.
Mm-hmm.
It's meant to be profound in a
Right.
way that impresses impressionable minds to say, ooh, yeah, totally blown away. I can't believe this is real.
Yeah.
Well, what if it's not?
Right.
So, yeah, I don't know. I think anytime you describe things like that, or I hear stuff like that, it's just like me thinking that at the core of the moon is cheddar cheese. And that's what the core of the
Yeah.
moon is made out of. And no one can tell me different, because wouldn't that be crazy and profound if it was?
Yeah.
It's like, okay, if we're going to make things up, we can just make up anything. So we can't, I don't know. I don't like to appeal to, well, we don't know.
Right.
So God must have done it.
Yeah. Yeah. I can see that. I understand that.
But to bring it all back around to free will,
Yeah.
I think for me, after looking at this a little more, just to prepare for our talk,
Mm-hmm.
I feel a lot more comfortable with the idea that everything around me is producing the exact brain state that I have, that bubbles up these thoughts. And I think I've had a lot of time to allow the idea that I'm not the author of my thoughts to actually take
Mm-hmm.
hold. Because if you witness the experience of thinking and just simply try to witness thoughts as they arise and how they arise, you'll quickly say that we have no clue what we're going to think next.
Right.
We literally don't. What are you going to think next? Like it could be literally anything.
I feel like at times I have control. I have control over what I'm thinking about in a general sense, but in a specific sense, not so much. If that makes sense.
It does, yeah. You could focus your brain on something like reading a book,
Mm-hmm.
where you're going to consume information, and that information may or may not inspire you to think of something. It might inspire you to think about your next meal because you're getting hungry.
Right.
I'll read a paragraph and literally have no clue what I just read and have to reread the thing over again because my mind just literally takes a left turn and I'm like checked out, but I'm still reading the
Right.
words.
Do that all the time.
But I didn't choose that, right? I didn't choose to be distracted.
Right.
In fact, one could say I was making every effort to not be distracted. And
Right.
I'm just successful at it sometimes, and sometimes I'm not. And then I have to hit the redo button.
Yeah, it's like trying to meditate. It's so hard sometimes. I mean, professionals maybe can do it, but to quiet, right, the mind and to put aside the thoughts, that is not an easy thing to do.
You know what the big unlock for me was on meditation?
Hmm.
It's not about removing your mind of thoughts, because that's literally impossible.
Right.
It's simply about watching them, witnessing them arise and disappear.
Mm.
Now that is so much easier said than done. That's the true practice of
Right.
meditation. The promise is you don't get caught up in whatever emotion that any of these thoughts can instantly put you in, or you can move away from those emotions very quickly.
Right.
But this whole thing on free will, I really do believe it hinges on the idea that we are not the author of our thoughts. If you can't get there, I think the rest of it is really tough to digest, or it has
Tough
been
to
for
get
me.
to. Yeah. So, talking about free will and randomness, this is kind of interesting, right? Because I think that randomness may open the potential, right, for the idea of free will. And we see, I think from physics, this says that at the most minute level of cellular activity, it's random, at least to some extent. I don't really understand it, but there's randomness at kind of the base of cellular activity.
Mm.
And to my mind, I feel like that randomness frees up the concept of free will for potential. Because if there is that randomness at the base of cellular activity that is making thoughts rise up, there's the potential to go back and say, maybe that balloon's not red, maybe that balloon's purple or something.
Mm.
But I don't know.
I don't know either. Harris did talk about this on his podcast. His concept of free will, or the lack of free will, or free will being an illusion, also, I would say, excludes randomness, because if a truly random event happened to you, then in the idea of free will, where would the freedom of choice be in that situation?
Right.
It would be, you would be affected by a cause that's completely outside of you, and influencing, whatever is going on. So there's still no choice in that scenario. Now, whether on the atomic level, you've got randomness happening, I don't think it gets you to where you've got a free will scenario on the macro scale of random events, because it's still an outside.
It's still random.
It's a cause that's outside of us, like outside of
Right.
our ability to choose it or not, that is happening, that's affecting us. So that's how I would see, or the best way maybe I can explain the
Okay.
idea of randomness.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I feel like I need to do like more research on that maybe idea. Because I think I understand both positions to some extent, and I'm not sure which one I prefer.
where could randomness get you to free will, I guess?
Well,
would
I
be the
feel like
question.
the idea that random things are happening on the smallest level raises the possibility for different choices as we rise up. As like that single cell becomes, the emergent trillions of cells that human beings are. I don't understand how that would influence that or interact with that. Like we wouldn't expect a single cell to be able to, one day design an airplane, but when we put trillions of those together, maybe it can do that. So I don't know how any of all of that might be able to come together in some way and create some sort of pathway towards the concept of free will. Does that make sense?
I don't. To me, they wouldn't be. There wouldn't be a connection there, um, because you're still working within the confines of things that are outside of your control. One example is from Harris's podcast. We're not free to tell our heart to stop beating. We're
Right.
also not free to have our cells stop dividing.
Right.
We don't have control whether our liver works or not, in the sense of, given anything that we present it, obviously we're going to affect things. If you stab your heart with a knife, you're going to make it stop beating. But
Right.
in the sense of free will, like it's a thought, it's a choice. We don't have these choices. These things are happening whether we consciously want them to happen or not. So I would say the stuff that's happening outside of our conscious layer of awareness, like the experience of what it is to be alive,
Mm-hmm.
has nothing to do with how we feel as a free agent, like we can make our own decisions or not. Those things might be causal, though. Those things might
Mm-hmm.
determine whatever state our brain is in, so that the balloon is red, or maybe a week later the balloon is blue. All of
Right.
those things, and I think this is the tricky part, all of those variables are nearly invisible.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's so easy for the illusion to appear real, because we're not paying attention to necessarily all of the variables that are happening, maybe on an unconscious level, that are affecting our choices or affecting how our brain is thinking or working in that specific moment. And
Okay.
so it's so easy to think that, we're the ones pulling the strings. But
Mm-hmm.
I think if you think through it, it's clear that we are the product of a lot of things we had zero choice in.
So I feel like the idea of not being able to control your heartbeat, those kinds of things, it explains how it can explain how thoughts rise, but it doesn't explain to me the uniqueness that I see in human beings. Does that make sense?
Well, I think they're different things.
Okay,
I
because
don't
I
I don't think that they are I don't think they're linked in a way that is one follows the other type of thing. Like we can be I think what you're saying is, if we didn't have the freedom to choose, then we would all end up kind of doing the same thing. Is that what you're asking?
no, like I feel like Harris is explaining the how things happen, but not why they happen.
Okay.
And I feel like that's where I'm losing it. Like that's where I'm getting muddy. And
Well,
that's where for me things like philosophy and religion might kind of help fill some of those gaps and maybe not explain, but maybe help along.
buckle in.
Here we go.
There is no why.
Right. There is no self.
Well, yeah. I guess I definitely understand the why gap. I mean, this is such a big question. It's
Yeah.
almost like saying, why are we
Yeah.
here even
Right.
talking about this at this very moment? Why do we have the capacity to think of ourselves in this way, right? Like, why does this all exist?
Right. The uniqueness of humans, right? The ability to write a symphony, enjoy that symphony.
Exactly, exactly. But I definitely think that was out of the scope of Harris's talk when it comes to the free will conversation. But I
Right.
would say that, um, at least for me, I don't have to operate with that in place in order to enjoy that symphony. Does that make sense?
Right.
Like I don't have to question whether I like reading a poem or looking at a nice painting or just enjoying a wonderful bowl of ice cream.
Mm-hmm.
I just do. And so I've found freedom in giving up the idea that everything has to have a reason and a rhyme and,
Right.
a place when the world could work perfectly without one. In so much as there's a lot of randomness going on. And if we're the
Mm-hmm.
product of a lot of that randomness, even if you think of evolution and how we got here, that
Yeah.
idea of, well, random selection brought us to this place where we can actually talk about our own consciousness, as humans, then randomness is perfectly a fine place to leave that scenario for me.
I appreciate that. But for me, I think I'm a little bit different in that I enjoy kind of the exploring the whys, even if it's totally gray and there's no black and white.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Like there doesn't I don't know any answers, but I
Yeah.
enjoy exploring that.
I guess I come from an ideology that said, um, if we don't know, we're just going to start making stuff up that we don't have any evidence of, and we're gonna base our lives off of that. And
Right.
for me, that's where I'm perfectly okay with saying I don't know,
Yeah.
and that is okay.
Right.
So
I agree with you there.
I like the I don't know answer. Yeah. As soon as you
Yeah.
start throwing in supernatural this and that, that's kind of where I check out and
Right.
would rather leave it at, well, I don't know, but it is fascinating to think about.
Yeah, it is. I'm with you. So maybe much of this comes down to is this, conversation even necessary? What how does this change things?
Well, and yeah, I mean, it might not actually matter in the grand scheme of things because, in a way, if whatever's going on in the operating system of the universe is going on,
Hmm.
then we can't really do anything to change that, I would say. I think it matters for me, it matters in so much that I can quickly move on from ideas that are more supernatural based that don't have relevance to how I think the universe does work.
Hmm.
So I'm not caught up in things that I feel are moving me down the wrong path. That's where I see this as a valuable exercise.
Yeah, I agree. For me, I think it's the same thing. Working through at least some of this, the little bit that I understand, anyway, as I think try in some ways helps me move towards ideas of religion and gods that I can live with. Right.
Now, there is one huge benefit that Harris talked about if
Hmm.
we're capable of giving up the illusion of free will that has moral implications. And it's the idea of we really don't have a strong reason for anger for anyone else, knowing
Right.
that their decisions aren't necessarily something that they authored. Um, and this gets very tricky very
I was
quickly.
gonna say I feel like this is another podcast.
Let's just say your thoughts aren't something that you author, then the idea of feeling bad about what you think can quickly go away. And if you then allow yourself that same compassion when it comes to doing things you might regret, you can quickly bring yourself to a place of compassion, knowing that there's a lot going on that you might not be seeing. Not to excuse the idea that you can make bad decisions. We have consequences and those are good. Those are actually part of the causal events to help us do things that are good
Okay, I
for
could
each
see that
other.
reasoning. Yeah.
But the regret that comes with all of the things that feeling like if you could rewind the universe, you could change what you did, can go away. And that's beautiful.
Right. That I could see being a very potential very beneficial thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. This is really interesting, and I really have no idea what I actually believe. but at least knowing some of these concepts and some of these ideas may help me work through it
Exactly.
to some extent.
Well, this has been another fun episode of The Bacon Show. If you have any thoughts about our topic today, feel free to reply to anything that we said down in the comments. That would be interesting. Yes. Help us. We want to start conversations around these ideas, and who knows, maybe we can all learn something new.
Hopefully.
Well, I'm Stefan.
I'm Mike.
We'll talk to you next time.